Gene Editing and Human Enhancement #2 from the years 2000 to 2010. Well, thereabouts. The Cloning and Stem Cell Wars. Hello, I'm Ted Peters, and welcome to the second in our series on gene editing and human enhancement. Will genetic science and genetic technology provide our researchers with the tools they need to remake human nature, to guide the evolutionary future of Homo sapiens? What are the ethical and theological implications of this dramatic frontier in natural science? The cloning controversy erupted in February of 1997. The first isolation of human embryonic stem cells was either July or August of 1998. Our research team working in the Human Genome Project for the National Institutes of Health in Berkeley, we finished our work around 1994, but the stem cell researchers had approached us, and so we were already on site as ethicists, bioethicists, when the isolation of human embryonic stem cells took place in 1998. Somewhere around the year 2000, we can say, the cannons were fired that started the cloning and stem cell wars that persisted throughout the first decade of this new millennium. And to that story we will now turn. Our monitoring of the cloning and stem cell wars is an exercise in public theology. Public theology is conceived in the church, reflected on in the academy, and addressed to the wider culture. Of its 5 tasks, its pastoral, apologetic, political, and prophetic tasks, we're going to focus here on developing a theology of nature. We will use theological resources to understand the natural sciences, in this case, the genetic sciences in relationship to the cloning question and human embryonic stem cell research. On the right, meet Ian Wilmot from Scotland. Ian is widely known for having cloned Dolly the sheep. What did he do? Ian took a cell from a 7-year-old sheep and he starved it of nutrients. And the cell with the DNA in it went quiescent. It went to sleep, so to speak. Then he took an embryo from another sheep and carefully removed the DNA nucleus. So now you have an enucleated egg. He put the enucleated egg right next to the cell with the quiescent DNA, hit it with a shock of electricity. The enucleated embryo absorbed the cell with the quiescent DNA. He hit it with a second shot of electricity, and the sleeping DNA woke up, and now it was undifferentiated. That is to say, it was not differentiated as a 7-year-old DNA nucleus would be, but rather it was de-differentiated. It was brand new. It could make a baby. And so He took this egg with the inserted DNA, placed it in the womb of a third sheep, and eventually Dolly was born with precisely the DNA that he had engineered. Here's Nature magazine with a picture of Dolly the sheep, a clone, and note it's in February. Ian came to the United States then a few weeks later, I think in mid-March, and he is standing here behind the podium at the AAAS, the American Association for the Advancement of Science. This conversation is taking place in an auditorium that had just been completed. This is the first public event in the AAAS auditorium. Ian Wilmot is sharing his science, and the AAA asked for a panel of respondents, 3 people if I remember correctly, and I was one of them, a theologian. So he's delivering a scientific paper on how he created Dolly, but the AAAS felt they needed a theologian to respond. What is going on here? Is there something intrinsically religious? Is there something inescapably ethical or moral about this science? Now, the public became very excited about cloning, the duplication of a genome from a mature to a newly born sheep. But scientifically, that's not really what was exciting. The worldwide conversation that followed, fostered by the news, was the excitement over the prospect that 2 animals or 2 human beings could be walking around with identical genomes. The scientists were more excited about the advances that Ian Wilmot had made in developing the technology of somatic cell nuclear transfer. My daughter Elizabeth and I visited Dr. Wilmot at his laboratory not far from Edinburgh in Scotland. He said that Dolly the sheep had become so popular that people coming to visit would call her and she would walk over and stand on her hind legs in order to engage her frequent guests, and she was getting arthritis in her legs because of her unusual daily pattern. As Ian Wilmot was nearing completion of his experiments, he formed an ethics committee drawn from the Church of Scotland, and this ethics committee was busy at work already before the first public announcement of cloning. I point this out because quite frequently it is falsely believed that scientists just run on helter-skelter, and the ethicists just have to kind of catch up and clean up afterward. Not necessarily the case when it comes to genetics. I found that molecular biologists in general like it when they're working hand in hand with the ethicists. Meet Michael D. West. We have left Ian Wilmot and Dolly the sheep in Scotland. We're now back in the United States, And Michael West is the founder of the Geron Corporation, just south of San Francisco in 1990, and then a few years later, Advanced Cell Technology, or ACT, in Boston. Michael, a real innovator in genetics, is responsible for human embryonic stem cells. How did that happen? Michael named his first company Geron. That's a word taken from the Greek account of Nicodemus and Jesus talking about getting born again and living forever. Michael is a disgruntled ex-Christian and now an atheist. He thinks that science can do what religion promised but failed to do, that is to say, create everlasting life. He dedicated himself to the scientific pursuit of everlasting life after his father died. From deep within my soul, I erupted in an explosion of anger at the death of his father. This won't happen. I shouted out loud at the thought of death. This was the most profound experience of my life. I realized that it was simply not in my nature to accept death or be defeated by it. And from this arose his vocation as a scientist. It was crystal clear to me what I had to do. I had to defeat death. I had to set in place a meaning for my own individual life. One of his first triumphs at the Geron Corporation in the first half of that final decade of the 20th century was the telomerase theory of aging. I will skip over that for the time being and move on to his vision of stem cells, and he originally called them, are you ready, immortal cells, cells that would continue to divide indefinitely. Michael came to the GTU, to Berkeley, to meet with those of us on the Human Genome Project Theology and Ethics research team. Would we join him in the pursuit of human embryonic stem cells, offering ethical commentary? And he really wanted it to be interreligious and multi-philosophical, but he definitely wanted serious ethical deliberation as he pursued the development of what he called immortal cell lines. Later we would call them human embryonic stem cells. What is a stem cell? How about this definition from the California Institute of Regenerative Medicine? A stem cell is a culture-derived, self-renewing human cell population that is capable of trilineage differentiation potential into tissues of the endoderm, ectoderm, and mesoderm. This definition includes both embryonic and non-embryonic human stem cell lines, regardless of the original tissue of origin. Did you get that? The culture derived means petri dish. Self-renewing means that the stem cell line would renew itself in its undifferentiated form in perpetuity, as long as you feed it. And then the trilineage, that means it would make the three basic forms of substem cells, the endoderm, the ectoderm, and the mesoderm. That is to say, every cell in the body could be derived from one single immortal stem cell. Now, the primary origin, note how we've got embryonic and non-embryonic. We'll say more about that later. But the primary source or derivation is from human embryos. Are there other sources? Yes. We're going to focus on the human embryonic stem cell, but there are other sources. I'll mention them briefly as we continue. When the ethical war breaks out over stem cells, the battle is less over the potential of stem cells for therapy and more over the derivation. Let's talk about human embryonic stem cells. Note what we have on the left. We have an egg with a DNA nucleus, and we can activate it. We could do cloning. We could remove the original DNA nucleus and put in a nucleus from a 7-year-old sheep if we want, right? So with or without cloning, we now have a fertilized egg that gets activated. Now that egg divides, and each separate cell has the total DNA in it. And any one of these cells now could make a baby. That is to say, they are undifferentiated in their DNA. Now, when we get to days 4 to 6, this outer band here is called the trophectoderm. And then within that, we have this inner cell accumulation called the inner cell mass, and that's where the gold is. So what the molecular biologist does between days 4 and 6 is pulls out the inner cell mass, separates these, and puts them in a petri dish and feeds them. And then they continue to divide in perpetuity in their undifferentiated form. They're called pluripotent. That is to say, they can make all 3 forms of tissue. Could they make a baby? Well, in principle, they could. They're called totipotent if they can make a baby. They're called pluripotent only if they make cells. Could these stem cells also be totipotent? Let me just tell you that the geneticists were sufficiently ambiguous on this that it was rarely made clear that stem cells can be totipotent as well as pluripotent. Now, these are human embryonic stem cells deriving from an activated fertilized egg. At the same time, well, by the way, Geron Corporation funded the grant that took place, granted research took place at the University of Wisconsin that was the first one to successfully isolate HES cells. At the same time, Geron had funded experiments at Johns Hopkins University, which produced human embryonic germ cells, which were thought to have exactly the same value and function. This was a less successful line of research. We're not going to follow that at this particular point. We're going to just stick with this one because the HES cells were the ones that have had the most potential for medical development of the various options. Here we are at the Geron Corporation. Michael West had departed Geron before the successful derivation of stem cells to start ACT in Boston. He was replaced by director Tom O'Karma, who followed through on creating the Ethics Advisory Board, and we began our work in July of 1998. And in August, only a month later, we got the news that the University of Wisconsin was successful in creating the first HES line. We were criticized in the press. Why? Ethicists sell out to grubby capitalists? And we thought, gee, we're grateful the scientists even want us around. And at the same time, would you want the grubby capitalists to be doing their research without any ethicists around? Be that as it may, we had to get educated and fast regarding the science of stem cells, and we were at work for 3 or 4 months before we could even outline what the ethical and public policy issues might be. This cartoon represents the public image somewhere around the year 2000. You can see science racing ahead and the poor ethicists clamoring behind, trying to put a bridle on unbridled scientific research. Stem cells, cloning. I want to say that this image is slightly misleading because, at least in the cases of Ian Wilmot in Scotland or the Geron Corporation in the United States, we found the molecular biologists anticipating what would be coming in their future and inviting the ethicists in to share in their work. That's not fake news. Those of us on the ethical advisory board for Geron did some writing on behalf of the corporation. We published a summary of issues in the Hastings Center report, I believe, in February or so of 1999. We also did our own independent research and writing. Recall I wrote the book Playing God with Francis Collins Forward in the late 1990s. I issued a second edition in 2003 that included the cloning and stem cell wars, and then a small book, non-technical book, called The Stem Cell Debate for Fortress Press. The major study was co-authored by myself, Karen LeBox, and Gaiman Bennett, Sacred Cells. We worked intensely for a number of years in order to tell the stem cell story and to get really precise on who was saying what and why in the various controversies. By the time we published it, there was only a short breather before the CRISPR gene editing technology began to absorb people's attention, and some of the interest in stem cells waned. The media frenzy over cloning and then stem cells initially was chaotic. About the only theme one could pull out of the frenzy was yuck. What the scientists are doing in cloning and stem cells creates a big sense of yuck. By about the year 2000 now, the bioethicists had consolidated their positions, identified issues, and in many cases decided which side of an issue they would take. One of our tasks as the Ethical Advisory Board was to analyze and categorize the public arguments. We came up with 4. This is mainly the genius of Gaiman Bennett and his research, but we all shared. The first is the embryo protection bioethical framework. Roman Catholics and Southern Baptists who had taken an anti-abortion position earlier were now defining what's going on in stem cell research as a variant on the abortion issue, and they wanted to protect that embryo, that early embryo, from being disambiguated in the 4 to 6 day period in order to harvest those stem cells. The Presbyterians, who were pro-choice, had already decided in the abortion debate that you could sacrifice the embryo for other purposes, and they would give a thumbs up. So the embryo protection framework was one framework. The second, closely related, we'll call the nature protection, or it's best known as the anti-playing God framework. And that's yuck. I don't like this for some repugnant reason. Yuck began to take form as those genetic scientists are playing God, and we should stop it. Number 3, medical benefits, or beneficence is the bioethical term here, where the issues center around the potential benefits to human health and well-being that this medical science could afford to everybody. Then fourthly, the professional standards, because of the public uproar and the religious valence of that public uproar, those who were sponsoring research wanted to formulate public standards that reflected on the religious controversy but did not embrace or even learn from the religious controversy. They wanted a secular set of standards that scientists, regardless of their own confessional position, could adhere to that would set the ethical standard. So what I want to do now is provide some examples of how the bioethical struggle took place, but on at least 4 different discernible fronts. First, the embryo protection bioethical framework. Roman Catholics could dip back into the 1970s and draw up previous arguments against abortion and apply them now in the stem cell setting. Champions were Cardinal Ratzinger and Pope John Paul II, and some very smart, very talented Roman Catholic bioethicists who argued that derivation of human embryonic stem cells is immoral on the grounds that activated conceptus, the egg with the DNA in it, should be treated with the same dignity as a human person. It is also unnecessary, that is to say, stem cell research and therapy is unnecessary because we can obtain pluripotent stem cells without destroying the embryo. Where would we get those stem cells? Answer: cord blood. When a baby is born, there are stem cells in the cord blood, and it is perfectly legitimate from a Roman Catholic point of view to use what are called adult stem cells in research, and therefore you don't need to harvest human embryonic stem cells. It turns out that second one is false, at least false in the modified sense that the pluripotent human embryonic stem cells can do far more than the adult stem cells harvested from cord blood, and therefore the researchers, the stem cell researchers, were unpersuaded by the unnecessary argument. Southern Baptists tended to borrow the Roman Catholic arguments to hold their own, to state their own position. The Presbyterians also felt that embryo protection was the issue, but they fell on the opposite side from that of the Pope and the Cardinal. Let's look at the Vatican position in a bit more detail. The Vatican position is archonic in character. That is to say that essence is determined by origin. What is the origin of the human person that deserves to be treated with dignity? Answer: conception. Pope John Paul II made his position quite clear that at conception, 23 genetic chromosomes are provided by the mother, 23 chromosomes are supplied by the father, and when the new genome is created, as part of divine providence, this is God's way of creating a new and unique individual. And at that moment, God creates a soul and imparts the soul. So that conceptus in the petri dish of the stem cell researcher is the product of three inputs: the mother's genes, the father's genes, and the impartation of a spiritual soul. All that happens at conception, says the Pope. Now, in the abortion controversy of the 1970s, what we were talking about was the removal of a fetus from the mother's body. In the case of stem cell, the conceptus is not in the mother's body, never was. It's an in vitro fertilization, and the activated conceptus never sees the mother's body, but appears only in the petri dish and is disaggregated between days 4 and 6, and the stem cells get harvested. From Pope John Paul II's point of view, that's the equivalent of abortion. It is the equivalent of denying dignity to that unique person which God is responsible for establishing at the moment of conception. The Pope's position is classically called creationism. Now, creationism here does not mean what it means for the anti-evolutionists. No, it means that God creates brand new a spiritual soul for each individual that is imparted then during the birth process. That's the creationist position of Pope John Paul II. When does all this take place? When is it that the unique genome is established and God imparts that specially created soul? Well, for Pope John Paul II and Cardinal Ratzinger, it happens in a moment, in a flash. At the very moment when the sperm penetrates the egg, all three of these contributions become valid. Not so. Say some scientifically informed Roman Catholic bioethicists. They argue instead that there is no such thing as a unique individual person until the 14th day, and only when the early embryo is in the mother's body and never when it's in the petri dish. What are we talking about? Well, if conception takes place within the mother's body, that conceptus divides into 4 and then into 8 and then into 16, and all of those cells are duplicates. If for some reason or another they get separated, you could end up with twins or quadruplets. Never triplets, because there's always a division of 2. And so if you have 3 identical triplets, it means there was once 4 and one got passed. So twinning can occur there just prior to days 4 and 6, and can even occur after that. So we don't know how many babies you're going to get out of that one genome until the embryo adheres to the uterine wall of the mother, and a primitive streak occurs where marking the place where the backbone will eventually take place. And at that moment, you can tell whether you're going to have 1 child, 2, or 4. And all of them would have exactly the same genome. No, they don't have unique genomes. They're individuals, to be sure, but their genomes are shared. We call them identical twins, or triplets, or quadruplets. So these Roman Catholic bioethicists want to describe conception as a process, and the criteria laid out by Cardinal Ratzinger and Pope John Paul II are not met until roughly the 14th day. And in Great Britain and in other locations, the 14th day is actually considered the first day in which you can stop or prohibit or proscribe research on the early embryo. The 14th day position. Was the Pope persuaded by these arguments? No. If you want to debate what's going on within the embryo protection bioethical framework, you're going to ask the question, where does personhood begin? Does it begin right here, as Pope John Paul II says it does, with the zygote, the fertilized egg, the so-called unique genome? Is that where personhood and hence dignity begins? And once you've established personhood and dignity, then you need to leave your hands off? Or here, days 4 to 6, the blastocyst, remember we called this external shell, the trophectoderm. The inner cell mass is where we have the stem cells, and they are removed, and that's where we get then the tray of immortal cells that go on and can be developed into any tissue and become therapeutic. Or does personhood begin here? Now, this diagram doesn't actually designate the 14th day. I had to add it. There are bioethicists who will argue that individuation occurs at the 14th day, roughly speaking, 12 to 15 days, when the embryo adheres to the uterine wall of the mother, and then for the first time we know how many we have. Or here. So if you're going to justify abortion at any stage, then you might want to say, well, human dignity begins at birth. Now, I just want to mention this is not an idle argument here, this 14-day rule. It carries a lot of weight. It carries a lot of weight with research scientists. It's not just an intramural argument for theologians. The state of Georgia, 2009. Georgia is influenced by the debate over stem cells within the embryo protection framework. So the state of Georgia says they want to recognize all human embryos as having the legal right to life. Note the language borrowed from the abortion controversy. Legal right to life and legal protection under the laws of the state of Georgia. That means if you are a stem cell researcher, you cannot disaggregate that blastocyst in order to harvest those stem cells because you are violating the right to life of that embryo. The state of Georgia wants also to provide that it shall be unlawful for any person or entity intentionally or knowingly create or attempt to create an in vitro human embryo by a means other than fertilization of a human egg by a human sperm. That is to say, no cloning. So this debate over the protection of the embryo, this debate over the unique genome of the embryo has made it into public policy. Let's move on now to the second of our bioethical frameworks, the one we're going to call the anti-playing God framework. Routinely, those within this framework oppose stem cell research, oppose cloning. And you know you're in this framework when you hear language such as playing God, Brave New World, Prometheus, Hubris, Frankenstein, or Jurassic Park. Let me just review this again briefly. The gene myth, which I described in the previous voice thread, includes Promethean determinism, which means that we, the scientists amongst us, we can govern, control, determine the genetic future of the human race. Prometheus, recall, in the world of darkness, saw the sun lighting Mount Olympus where the guards dwell, and he snuck up to the sun with his torch, lit his torch on fire, and brought the sun's fire back down to earth, and lit candles and stoves and campfires, and Zeus got mad. Prometheus had no right to enter the realm of the gods and steal something that was divine. And so Zeus chained Prometheus to the rock, and an eagle came each day to eat his liver. I figure that's a yucky story. But the myth of Prometheus lives on in contemporary culture, especially in bioethics. Prometheus is described as having hubris, the Greek word for pride. Paul Tillich defines hubris as the elevation of the self into the sphere of the divine. Frankenstein, the fictional book written by Mary Shelley, is called a modern Prometheus. Brave New World, the dehumanized future dystopia by Aldous Huxley, where all of society is organized around genetics. And then finally, Jurassic Park, the classic Promethean application to genetics, where the hubris of the scientist leads to chaos as dinosaurs run wild and eat us up. The way to prevent Prometheus from creating chaos is to obey the commandment, thou shalt not play God. And in this case, it means thou shalt not engage in cloning or stem cell research. Recall how I described the first media frenzy over cloning as religious yuck. For some reason or another, what was going on in science appeared to have a religious valence. And that valence can best be summarized as yuck, I don't like what's going on here. Take a look at the cover of Der Spiegel. It's a German magazine similar to Time magazine in English. And we see here a visage of Dolly the sheep, and then a long line of clones of Adolf Hitler, clones of Albert Einstein, clones of Claudia Schiffer, who was a very popular model in Germany at the time. And what do we get here? Wissenschaft auf dem Weg zum geklonten Menschen. Science on the way to cloning human beings. Did Ian Wilmot clone a human being? No. Does he ever plan on cloning a human being? No. But if you're in the media to show Adolf Hitler and lots of them, causing us to tremble in trepidation that the world might be engulfed with evil one more time, and it's the scientists who are responsible. Now get this in capital letters. What do we see here? Der Sündenfall, the fall into sin. And when you read the article, they ask, are our scientists leading the present generation into sin in a way that Adam and Eve have led the entire human race into sin? Science leads us to sin. Yuck. Yuck needed philosophical underpinning if it could be sustained as a bioethical argument, and Leon Kass came to the rescue. Leon is one of America's great Jewish intellectuals, University of Chicago, asked by President George Bush to chair the U.S. President's Council on Bioethics beginning in 2001, precipitated by the cloning and stem cell controversies. Note what Leon says. Cloning represents the Frankenstein. Okay, we know now we're in the tradition of Prometheus, right? The Frankenstein hubris, he doesn't even translate it into pride. It's the Greek word, and it was hubris, if you may recall, that led Prometheus to overstep the line and enter the realm of the gods and had to be punished by the god Zeus. Cloning represents the Frankenstein hubris to create a human life and increasingly to control its destiny, men playing at being God. Our attempt to control the destiny of the human race through genetic engineering can be called playing God. Note, this has got nothing to do with Christianity or standard religion. Playing God here references only Prometheus, who had overstepped the line, played God, and it resulted in chaos. The phrase playing God is not a Christian theological concept. It is drawn from Greek mythology. Now, as I said earlier, the initial frenzy in the media over cloning and stem cells is a form of inchoate yuck. Dr. Cass gives us a very respectable philosophical term for it: repugnance. Your and my repugnance is the emotional expression of deep wisdom. In other words, if you feel yuck about cloning and stem cells, attend to those deep feelings because morally they are right. Put up a red traffic light against cloning and stem cell research. Victor Frankenstein says to Igor, his assistant, "Bring me a stem cell." Let's go on to our third now, bioethical framework, beneficence, in which we forecast, anticipate, hope for the great medical advances that will result, especially from embryonic stem cells, because those stem cells are pluripotent. They can regenerate, rejuvenate otherwise damaged or sick cells in our bodies and in our organs. You can follow up a heart attack with regenerative medicine that will make that heart stronger than before it had its heart attack. Almost all of the organs of the body could be regenerated with stem cell therapy. The Geron Corporation doctors and researchers have concluded that you and I cannot live forever. There are reasons why we die, but they do think that we can live to be 120, and with stem cell therapy regenerating our organs, we can be happy right up to 119. Right up to a day or two before we die. We won't have that long, degenerative, and expensive and painful period of suffering in the hospital before we die. We can be as frisky as a rabbit until the day before we die through stem cell therapy. Beneficence, doing good. That is the bioethical framework that we're going to look at next. It was Asclepius, the uncle of Hippocrates, who gave us the maxim, first do no harm. In bioethical language, that's the principle of non-maleficence. If you can avoid harm, avoid it. Beneficence is the flip side. Aggressively look for ways to improve human health and well-being. Recall Jesus' story of the Good Samaritan. A man is mugged on the road, his possessions stolen, he's beaten and left on the side of the road to die. A couple of upstanding individuals, respected people in society, pass by, look at the man, and keep on walking. Well, they obeyed the principle of non-maleficence, right? They didn't do any harm. They didn't walk over and kick him. They just kept on walking. The Samaritan, coming down the road, rushes over, offers first aid, picks up the victim, puts him on his horse, and leads him into the next town. Could he go to the Good Samaritan Hospital? No, it hadn't been invented yet. So he goes to the inn and he tells the innkeeper, please take good care of this man. Here's some money. And if the expenses are too high, well, I'll pay the rest when I come back. And Christians for 2,000 years now create Good Samaritan hospitals based on the principle of beneficence. Let's get creative when it comes to healing. In the basement of the castle in Heidelberg, Germany, they have a small museum on the history of apothecary. Here's a painting of Jesus, the healer. Our word for salvation, coming from the New Testament, is literally healing. Jesus for the Christian is known as a healer, and the Christian doctrine of eschatology, looking forward to the kingdom of God, especially the symbol of the New Jerusalem, all things will be healed. There will be no crying nor pain. So when you and I support healing, yes, through stem cell research and the development of therapies, we can ask, are we serving the principle of beneficence? What might be the preferred bioethical framework for a Buddhist? Here we have interviews of Buddhist bioethicists in Malaysia. The dominant discussion is employing the embryo protection framework. The Buddhists say that, yes, human embryonic stem cell research can and should proceed, but use only surplus embryos. Do not create an embryo for the purpose of destruction at the blastocyst stage. Use only surplus embryos from IVF clinics that might otherwise get destroyed through deterioration. The blastocyst, that 4-day period, does not have consciousness of being. Therefore, it is not a matter of killing when the blastocyst is disaggregated for research purposes. On the beneficent side, the Buddhist is committed to compassion, and promoting human healing through science is consistent with that disposition of compassion. For Malaysian Hindus, the law of Dharma includes ahimsa, do no harm, and if you engage in harming someone, that can lead to bad karma. There's some debate as to whether ensoulment takes place at conception or 90 days after. The dominant view seems to be that the embryo has absorbed the Atman in transition from a previous life to the next life, so that the embryo is already a spirit matter composition. Therefore, it is valuable. It should be protected from harm. Nevertheless, upon quizzing, Hindu ethicists would say, yes, we should proceed with human embryonic stem cell research, but use only surplus embryos. Do not create embryos specifically for destruction. And like the Buddhists, blastocyst destruction is not a form of killing. And of course, there's a beneficence component here. Let's support this kind of medical science because it could lead eventually to the saving of many lives. The Jewish doctrine of creation includes the Tikkun Olam principle. The creation is unfinished. We human beings have a moral responsibility to finish it, and that means making it better. The Union of Orthodox Jewish Congregations of America, 2001, our Torah tradition places great value upon human life. If we are taught in the opening chapters of Genesis that each human was created in God's very image, the potential to save and heal human lives is an integral part of valuing human life from a Jewish perspective. On the basis of that theological premise, we support federal funding for embryonic stem cell research. How about a quiz? Imagine that you are a member of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. Which bioethical framework will you work from? Well, how about embryo protection? Our synod adheres to the fundamental truth that life begins at conception. Human cloning is a grievous assault on God as the author of life and an insult to him as Lord of life. Human cloning of embryos for the purpose of destroying them for their stem cells multiplies this horror immeasurably. So, Lutherans for life think an awful lot like Pope John Paul II thinks. And Leon Kass might actually enjoy this as well, even though Leon Kass does not hold the spiritual soul dimension or the unique genome dimension of the Pope's arguments. Which bioethical framework do you think the evangelical Lutheran Church in America would work out of? Genetics, Faith, and Responsibility, 2010, a social statement by the ELCA. I served on the task force that produced this statement. The dominant bioethical framework is beneficence, but there certainly were some mumbled voices that wanted to work out of the embryo protection framework. The ELCA values genetic science as an expression of the human responsibility to learn and predict, imagine, and invent for the sake of stewarding creation. The golden rule today bids humans to promote the benefit and betterment of the community of life. Genetic knowledge and technology offer stunning means to advance such efforts. What about GMOs, genetically modified organisms? The ELCA says, thumbs up. There are lots of farmers in the Midwest and Great Plains, and they virtually all rely on GMOs. My colleague Karen LeBach says, I don't want to eat any food that isn't genetically modified. So I don't think she shops at Whole Foods. What about cloning? The church will continue to reject human reproductive cloning. Now you probably want to know, well, what about stem cells? Well, most of the members of the task force were embryo protectionists who wanted to argue a pro-life position on abortion and an embryo protection position on stem cell research. Not everyone agreed. Some thought that the beneficence principle should trump embryo protection. Not being able to resolve the matter, you'll find quite equivocal language in this document. Richard Land of the Southern Baptist Convention had quite a bit to say during the cloning and stem cell debates. Our conception is not about stem cells or their incredible promise to relieve human suffering. That is to say, Land is acknowledging the beneficence principle. Stem cells are one of God's amazing biological gifts that may someday help bring healing. Okay, beneficence. But, now we turn to the second item. The issue at this time is the price we are willing to pay. The debate today is whether or not scientists should be allowed to destroy human embryos in order to obtain stem cells. We cannot justify the cannibalizing of another to benefit one who suffers. So, on behalf of protecting the human embryo, stem cell researchers look like cannibals. Here's the official position of the United Methodist Church General Conference. They want to put a ban on all human cloning, including the cloning of human embryos. Note it's human cloning. Dolly the sheep is okay, but don't create human beings through cloning. Put a ban on therapeutic, medical research, and commercial procedures which generate waste embryos. That is to say, when the stem cell researcher disaggregates the blastocyst, basically destroying the embryo, that is forbidden. So this looks like a embryo protection bioethical framework. The United Methodist Church did have some very active lobbyists in Washington, D.C. During the Genome Project and then well on into the period of President Bush's Bioethics Council on Bioethics, the COB. And those Methodists took the Leon Cass argument, the framework, against playing God. So we have these two complementary, though not identical, strains within the United Methodist Church, the embryo protection and the anti-playing God position. Let's see if we can follow the logic of the Presbyterian Church USA, General Assembly 2001. First premise. Stem cell research is closely connected to the morality of abortion. Yeah, we saw that with Vatican. Premise 2, we view abortion as not only protected under U.S. law, but as morally justifiable in certain circumstances. Premise 3, we believe the use of tissue derived from fetuses is morally and ethically acceptable. That concern over fetal tissue has to do with benefiting from abortions by using the tissue of abortuses for therapy. The Presbyterians approved not only abortion, but the use of the aborted fetus's tissue for therapy. Next premise. We affirm the use of human stem cell tissue for research that may result in the restoring of health to those suffering from serious illness. So we've got the beneficence principle at work here. So now the next and final conclusion is worded negatively, but I think you'll get the point. Prohibition of the derivation of stem cells. That's the Vatican position, or President George Bush's position. Prohibition of the derivation of stem cells from embryos would elevate the showing of respect to human embryos above that of helping persons whose pain and suffering might be alleviated. So the Presbyterians are taking the two principles, beneficence and embryo protection, and elevating beneficence above embryo protection. The argument here is essentially embryo protection, but the Presbyterians take a position just opposite that of the Vatican or the state of Georgia or the Southern Baptist Convention. Let me introduce you to the IOMS, the Islamic Organization for the Medical Sciences. The IOMS leadership is centered in Kuwait. It is made up of individuals with advanced degrees from Western universities, both in the research sciences as well as medical practice. They're also very knowledgeable of the history of Islamic theology. With considerable urgency and intensity during the first decade of this century, they sought to understand the implications of reproductive cloning and stem cell research so that they could come up with ethical policies to guide their own laboratories and hospitals. The IOMS asked me to serve as a consultant. I met with them 3 times, twice at the headquarters of the World Health Organization in Cairo, Egypt. They brought intellectuals, both in the sciences as well as Islamic theology, from all over the world, not just the Middle East, including Malaysia and Indonesia. And here's the bottom line. Reproductive cloning, thumbs down. Stem cell research, thumbs up. Here is one mufti making statements that were typical. Islam is all for improving health conditions. Islam only cautions against abuse. We should draw red lines to set limits. Well, here's the thumbs down on reproductive cloning. I believe that cloning is detrimental to human dignity and constitutes a crime against humanity. That sounds like anti-playing God, right? Cloning breeds the following problems: confusion and ambiguity for the person cloned. Who am I? It's an identity problem, I guess. Confusion in inheritance if 2 family members are identical. Well, what are you going to do about naturally born twins? Dangers demonstrated in animal cloning require caution in humans. Abdul Sachedina is vehement. Unanimity has now emerged among Muslim scholars. The idea of human cloning has been viewed negatively and almost satanic. Hamid Ahmed, regarding genetic research, we require more knowledge before we can make a final decision. Here is an observation I made that I found fascinating, and that is that a large number of the Muslim scientists and theologians were very sympathetic to the Vatican argument to embryo protection. They use the word dignity quite a bit. Shall we protect the dignity of the unborn fetus? Shall we protect the dignity of that fertilized conceptus in the petri dish? Should we forbid or prohibit the disaggregation of the blastocyst? That really was the dominant view for quite a long period of time. But finally, it was abandoned. Why? Because the doctrine of embryo protection could not be found in the Quran, and this group was committed that the Quran would be the final measure by which these ethical policies would be set. Recall how Pope John Paul II placed the moment of ensoulment at conception when the so-called unique genome is established. Others think of ensoulment as possibly at the 14th day when individuality is established. But for Muslims in the tradition of the Quran, you don't get ensoulment till 40 days after conception in the case of boys, 120 days after conception in the case of girls. This makes the Islamic position irreconcilable then with the Vatican position. And the IOMS debated this and decided to abandon the Vatican position to permit, if not encourage, embryonic stem cell research. As I mentioned, thumbs down on cloning, thumbs up on stem cells. Another issue appeared in the discussion that was just fascinating. As you probably know, Muslims throughout the Middle East take advantage of reproductive technologies. Genetics plays an important role in establishing inheritance. And married couples will frequently fertilize 10 eggs for in vitro implantation. And if they get a child, the first 2 or 3, then the other 7 sit in the freezer and they worry about that. What would happen if they accidentally got implanted in another woman and 20 years later the baby shows up and says, I want my share of the inheritance. Inheritance is determined by genetic continuity. So, wouldn't it be convenient if all of those 7 unused fertilized ova are sent to the stem cell laboratory and destroyed? So this is an extra theological factor that leads to the approval of stem cell research in Islamic bioethics. Meet Aida Al-Akil, research geneticist in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. She articulates well what has become then the established position: no reproductive cloning, yes to human embryonic stem cell research for therapeutic purposes. Now on to the least theological and most boring of the bioethical frameworks, and that is the professional standards. Those who set professional standards do not claim to base them on profound philosophical foundations. Rather, they are procedural, what gets approved or not approved as principles of research. Integrity, scientific integrity. Well, that's a wholesome concept, right? Separate abortion from research. Why? Is there a moral stand on abortion? No. Just want to stay out of controversy. Here we have values, no value theory, but we have 7 values to inform the professional ethics of scientists: honesty, fairness, objectivity, reliability, skepticism, accountability, openness. Those are good values. If our scientists embrace and incarnate those values, I think we'll all be happy. Then on the right, we have specific dissemination procedures and responsibilities. This is what you would expect from our scientific community. By and large, our scientists are people with integrity. At least that's my experience. Thank goodness. Now, through your yawning, you may be saying, hey, wait a minute. I thought we were talking about cloning and stem cells. What happened? Well, we'll get back to it now. During the administration of President George Bush from 2000 to 2008, there were sharp restrictions on federal funding for research that included the derivation of human embryonic stem cells. The Californians rebelled with Proposition 71 in 2004, voting for a $3 billion budget to support stem cells, including human embryonic stem cells. So I have served, at least for 10 years, served on the equivalent of the ethics policy setting working group, and this is one of our meetings. Take a quick look at this list of components in the proposition: $3 billion in bonds to support the research. And of course, the mood here is California should take the lead in stem cell research because of federal restrictions. Much of the research had gone to Singapore and other places outside the US, and California thought they could bring some of that research back. They're going to cover pluripotent and progenitor stem cells. That's your human embryonic stem cell. They're not going to be dissuaded by the embryo protection framework. No reproductive cloning. Why is that in there? Unencumbered by patents. They wanted to eliminate people filing for patents having used California funds, at least for upstream patents. That is not a rule that was strictly enforced. And then a number of other items. You'll see SMASWG, Scientific and Medical Accountability Standards. That's the working group that I have been a part of. The organization has been named CIRM, CIRM, the California Institute of Regenerative Medicine. Let me mention two items of interest coming out of the Medical Accountability Standards Working Group. First, we elected, after some debate, to prohibit research on embryonic stem cells after the 12th day. We considered the 14th day, backed it up to 12 just as a margin of safety. And you might say, why did we do that? What are the hidden theological or philosophical premises upon which that is based? Nobody would discuss that. Hidden theology poking its head up into professional standards. A second interesting happening was that those of us working with CIRM had to sign an agreement that indicated we would not benefit from any of the grants that were issued. That was to keep us impartial. On one occasion, the director approved I think, $170 million grant to Stanford University. Then he quit and went to work for Stanford at a much higher salary. He was not prosecuted. I complained. Funny thing, I've not been invited back to a SWIG meeting since. We gave $27 million to the Buck Institute to build a nice new building with up-to-date laboratories. One of the interesting agenda items for us was to combat snake oil, that is to say, charlatans who would take advantage of the popularity of stem cells and then advertise stem cell therapies for otherwise incurable diseases. Many of these snake oil salespeople arose in Mexico, but yes, even in Texas. People spend their fortune trying to cure incurable cancer and die, and the snake oil salespeople get rich. During this period, the derivation issue shifted slightly with the advent of iPS cells, induced pluripotent stem cells, whereby laboratory scientists didn't begin with a fertilized ova, but with already differentiated cells, and then used a procedure not unlike that of Ian Wilmot in bringing Dolly into the world of taking an already differentiated DNA and running it back to its pre-differentiated stage, and then beginning with a stem cell as well. iPS cells. Big advance in genomics. After George Bush left the White House and President Barack Obama moved in, the federal rules were changed, and now Uncle Sam looks a little bit more like California. Let's offer a brief review of the bioethical frameworks within which various religious traditions operate. The Buddhists, as we saw, work primarily out of the embryo protection framework, and they will permit stem cell research on surplus embryos, but not actually making an embryo for the purpose of destruction. Because the blastocyst at 4 to 6 days following conception does not have consciousness of being, It's not really killing when the blastocyst is disaggregated and the stem cells harvested. Buddhists also, out of compassion, want to affirm scientific research for medical purposes. The Hindu position is quite similar to that of the Buddhists. Surplus embryos okay, creating embryos for destruction not okay. That early embryo has absorbed the Atman, the soul, passing from a previous life through this life into the next life, and that warrants embryo protection. Hindus also celebrate positively the advances in medicine that could relieve human suffering. Roman Catholics work almost exclusively out of the embryo protection framework and go all the way back to conception, where the genomes of the mother and father create a new and allegedly unique genome crying out for human soul. God delivers a spiritual soul. And at that point, that early embryo warrants dignity and may not either be created for research purposes or destroyed in research. Southern Baptists hold pretty much the Roman Catholic position, embryo protection framework. Lutherans in the Missouri Synod, also embryo protection. Lutherans in the ELCA are a mixture of beneficence and embryo protection. Presbyterians, embryo protection, but they take a stand exactly 180 degrees opposite of the Roman Catholics. Because the Presbyterians were pro-choice on abortion. Therefore, the destruction of the embryo is permitted in medical research. United Methodists, embryo protection with a strong dose of anti-playing God argumentation. Jews, in their belief of tikkun olam, that the world is created but yet needs embetterment, will celebrate the advance of science for the relief of human suffering. Beneficence is going to be the Jewish framework. Muslims, embryo protection, but finally can take a position that will allow stem cell research with surplus embryos while rejecting categorically human reproductive cloning. And yes, beneficence similarly, can I pronounce that word, beneficence? Um, Similarly is what is driving the whole concern to establish a set of bioethical principles. California Proposition 71, strictly professional standards, and trying to hide or deny that there might be any theological or philosophical influence on those standards. Well, what are Ted's conclusions after all of this? First, science is insufficient to determine morally protectable personhood. Science all by itself cannot deal philosophically with questions of value, human dignity, human personhood, social responsibility. The scientists need to partner with philosophers and theologians and other morally sensitive and thoughtful persons in order to develop a moral vision. Number two, beneficence is ethically relevant. I grew impatient with those in the cloning and stem cell wars who could not see beyond embryo protection. Here we have a developing science and a potential technology that could so enhance human well-being and human flowering. If we are going to be stewards of God's creation, we want our scientists and their medical partners to improve life on planet Earth for the benefit, hence beneficence, for the benefit of the human species and all the others. Thirdly, a moratorium on reproductive cloning. I can live with that. I think cloning all by itself really accomplishes very little of value. Medical therapies and perhaps even enhancement techniques from stem cells, yes, they could provide enormous value. Cloning all by itself, probably not. Certainly when it comes to livestock and food production, cloning already has demonstrated its great value, and that's fine. But when it comes to human reproduction, I don't see any advantages, moral advantages to that. Finally, stem cell research. Should we stop it or encourage it? I say encourage it. Yes, stem cell research needs to be guided by a moral vision. We certainly need to protect human dignity. But at best, a blinking yellow traffic light, kind of shading towards green. Go for it. Thanks for joining us on this ride through gene editing and human enhancement number 2, the cloning and stem cell wars. Bye-bye.